pick up water and minerals. So the roots are, if to more specifically answer your question, if you can protect the roots under the drip line or under the canopy within the drip line, that's usually good enough to keep a tree alive. But if that is not the definition of the total tree protection root zone. So the more you can protect, the better. But you should certainly never allow a machine like that inside the drip line. Yes?
If the buttress roots have been covered up if the buttress roots have been covered up in a garden for a long time, what should we do?
If it's the question is if this area has been covered for a long time, you mean with like stones or
soil?
I'm sorry.
Soil.
Well, covered. In other words, covered above this level.
Yeah, there are no buttress roots showing on it.
That's a great question. I really enjoy it when people ask really intelligent questions. That's a great question because many times I've seen a lot of cases where people buy a home that's been lived in for many, many years by an elderly couple that finally couldn't stay there, and they move in and realize that these have been covered clear up to here someplace, and all the soil in which the roots are supposed to be are covered by sometimes a foot or more of soil. What do I do? Well, what you can do is clean, it's called root collar cleaning. You just clean around the trunk to leave an area about 2 feet wide away from the trunk, down to as deep as you have to dig. I've had clients call and say, we're 2 feet deep, how much deeper do we dig? And the answer is, can you see buttress roots? If you can't, keep digging, because you need to get down to the original grade or even a little below. But the answer to your question about what do you do out here is very different, because roots will have grown up into fill soil over the years, and now you have a tree that's dependent on the fill soil because that's where its absorbing roots are. If the fill was done a year or two ago, you can just take it away. But if it was done 10 years ago, you better not, because you're going to have taken all those roots that have grown up into that soil away. What you can do is gradually start adjusting the moisture that is applied to that topsoil and just work with it the best you can. But you have to realize that you're dealing with an artificial soil grade, not the original soil grade. Let's see. Yes.
Suzanne?
Remember that. And next, please. Don't do this. And don't do that. These are. This gentleman's well-meaning, but this is a incense cedar, Caliscedrus decurrens, and he's chopping up all the surface roots. Now, this happens to be in Los Gatos. The soil quality in this area is excellent, so he's just blind lucky. I won't say this was intelligent, but lucky that the roots are there probably are quite a few roots below that small rototiller's depth, but nonetheless, this is dumb. Don't do this. Yes, next picture. This is what an oak tree likes. Essentially, something under it to prevent the hot sun from striking the soil, something under it to prevent rapid evaporation of moisture in the soil. In other words, protection for those shallow roots. Pardon me, I'm doing what you've asked me not to do. This is rather dark, but you can see that what's happened here is a fine young oak. This oak's probably not more than 25 to 35 years old, which is a teenager for an oak tree. But you can see that they not only cut foundation cuts in order to install the building, and then installed a pathway, which requires usually a cut of 9 inches deep to install base material plus a surface. So an awful lot of these surface roots were cut. Whoever did this obviously has never taken, has never studied what the roots of trees do. So this is what they like. Anything different than this is harmful to the tree. I'm not suggesting that your yard has to look like this. I'm saying you have to recognize that you have to find a compromise. Okay. Next picture. The next thing you should not do to trees is overthin them. Now this is not a native, this is a blue atlas cedar from the Himalayas, but about probably 60 to 70 or maybe even 80% of the foliage has been removed from this tree. Unfortunately, the reason this was in Los Gatos, it is in Los Gatos, it's still there. The owner called an arborist and said there's something wrong with my tree. It looks very thin, so he thinned it. That's not what you should be doing. A tree needs leaf surface to manufacture carbohydrates, to carry through all the vascular tissue that is in these trunks down into the roots. Those carbohydrates are stored for next year's leaf production. In other words, next year the xylem tissue will carry fluids, including starches and sugars, from the roots up to produce foliage. Well, if you don't store enough of that food, you don't have enough to supply new foliage. In other words, if you take enough off of this, it's like taking money out of a savings account and not putting it back. So don't expect it to be there next year by magic. You need that foliage to produce carbohydrates for storage. And this is really very harmful. Fortunately, somebody with more wisdom and knowledge came along and had the tree, they stopped them from watering so much at the base. They fertilized it with half-strength fertilizer, and gradually, over about 10 years, this tree's recovered. But it was a close thing. Next picture, please. This is a deodar cedar in I forget the town, but it's the town in which the Davy Tree Surgery headquarters is, and they vastly overthinned this tree. This poor oak has been really badly overthinned. What happens when you take out the middle of a tree like this, if you can think about this again mechanically, the only place new foliage can be produced is at the end. All the food supply that was on these trunks was removed by overthinning, and the result is these limbs get longer, they get end weight heavier, and ultimately they break, or at the very least they bend over. On a cedar, most conifers, the stems are relatively poorly tapered, and the result is if you get too long a limb with too much end weight like that one, they don't have enough taper in the limb to support that weight, and they break. I do a lot of reviews of requests for tree removal in Mountain View, and there are often people asking to remove deodar cedars because they're broken limbs. But when I got out to look at them, I see that somebody has stripped out the middle of the tree, it's produced very long limbs, and of course it broke some. That's not the tree's fault. That's a person's fault. So over-thinning the interior of a tree, if you think about it mechanically, just is not the thing to do. These are elms that have been badly over-thinned, and I won't belabor the point. You can see for yourself. You can imagine how safe that limb is with almost no taper and all this weight of band. Here's what was a perfect Monterey cypress in San Francisco that has been thinned out in the middle. And the result is the limbs are too long with too much weight at the end, and this is what's happening. The next thing you should not do for your native oaks, or for any other tree really, is plant anything beneath them that needs frequent summer irrigation. Remember what I was saying about California doesn't have moisture when the weather's warm. We start doing this and it dooms those native oaks because they're not designed to tolerate that. What happens in a case like this is the diseases, oak root fungus and water mold disease, find this the perfect environment. It's warm, humid, and so the diseases are rampant, but the oak doesn't have the ingrained ability to defend against that. So that's where oak root fungus usually occurs. When we do surveys in the wild, we very seldom see oak root fungus in the wild. It's usually when there's people been around. Yes, ma'am.
So now, is redwoods an exception? You know, unfortunately, people have planted redwoods all around the peninsula. My neighbor has 5 redwoods right up against our fence.
Yep.
Now, is it a problem if the redwoods get summer water?
No, the right question. Oh, thank you. If you stand anywhere along Highway 280 and look to the west in the afternoon on a summer day, what you see is a massive blanket of fog creeping over there, and it's creeping through the redwoods and the cypress and the pines. And the only place you find redwoods growing naturally is where they get fog coming through the canopies every day. And if you put as a student from Cal Poly did 8 years ago, put a rain gauge beneath redwood trees, you find that they will produce 60 inches of rainfall from fog drip, aside from rain. In other words, redwoods naturally occur only where there is enough fog to provide plenty of water for them. They like all the water they can get. When at the Getty Museums, we have a grove of redwoods that are about 80 feet tall. There were 9 of them. They look really awful. And we were renovating an area, and I suggested, don't fool with them, just take them out. They said, no, they wanted to keep them. So I figured, I'm smarter than they are. I said, well, if you're going to try to keep them, you need to put 4 inches of mulch under the whole grove and put a soaker hose under all of those and turn it on very low so it runs at about 5 gallons per hour for 25 feet and just leave it there. So that soaker hose has been running for 6 years. But they've all recovered. And I was wrong. In the first place, I didn't think they'd do that. And in the second place, I didn't believe that we could get such marvelous recovery. But every one of those trees looks just fine now. In every case where I've had to deal with redwoods in trouble, the answer is just water. They need 20 gallons of water for 1 inch of trunk per month. Now, the problem is, I bet you've all seen it, that either your neighbor or somebody, a friend's neighbor, lives next to people who have sold their house